Although institutionalized party systems can often seem impervious to change, they remain vulnerable to shifts in circumstance that threaten their base of support. The recent international economic crisis brought to the fore fundamental changes that are occurring. Patterns of growth in the global economy, demographic shifts, the introduction of new technologies into politics, and other socio-political transformations are challenging political parties to adapt.
So, as you know, the rules are panelists are supposed to take around 7 minutes to discuss their topic. And so we'll start with Christophe Crombez, and the first paper is Europe, Where the Crisis Mattered.
Thanks, David. So, as David mentioned, I'm going to talk about Europe, political parties in Europe, and how the political landscape has changed. I think I'm one of the few people at this conference who will talk about Europe. So I guess that means that in the minds of the organizers, there isn't all that much disorder in Europe, or maybe it means that the disorder is not very new. I think I would tend to agree with the latter point, so that maybe the disorder is not very new. That will be maybe one of my points that I will make today. The first question I want to address is basically whether there is increased party instability in Europe as a result of the last years of the economic crisis. And I think if we sort of look at the different countries in Europe, that we can say that in some countries there has been more instability. If we look at what has happened in recent elections, there are some countries like Italy and Greece where voters have turned in very large numbers to totally new parties or to parties that used to be sort of fringe parties that got a couple of % of the vote and then suddenly in the past few elections, in the past few years, got to be almost or the largest parties in the political system. Then we have some other countries like Spain, Portugal, and even more so Ireland, where there have been significant moves of voters from one established party to another. Larger movements than there have ever been before. That definitely was the case in Ireland, and also happened in some other countries like Hungary or Iceland. Now, if you sort of look at the list of countries that I've gone through so far, these countries also happen to be the countries that were the most heavily affected by the economic crisis. So you could argue that there has been a lot of change in the party system in those countries that were really having the most significant problems, that had trouble staying in the Eurozone, or in case they were not in it to begin with, so their financial systems come close to collapse. In the other countries, there has not been all that much change. If we look at some of the largest countries in Northern Europe, Germany, France, even the UK, there has not been all that much of a movement recently, at least no movement that is significantly different from what happened before. If we look at these northern countries, then you can definitely see that the main political parties, and in most countries this is a socialist party and a conservative or Christian democratic party, that their shares of the votes have declined. But that's a movement that not only happened in the past couple of years, it's a movement that's been going on for decades. In these countries that I mentioned, Germany or the UK, if you look at the two largest parties, if you go back all the way to the 50s or even the early 70s, the largest two parties got 90% of the vote, or even more, 95% sometimes. Recently, this is not the case. If you look at the UK, the two largest parties together at the last election got about 2/3 of the vote only. And the same was true even more so in Germany, where the two largest parties together got less than 60% of the vote at the most recent general election. But this movement away from the traditional parties has been going on for decades. Now, what are the reasons for that movement? I think there are many reasons for it. The first one that I would mention is that voters in general have become a lot more demanding and a lot better informed also. And that as a result of that, they are more inclined to move away from one party to another, to punish parties that have been in power and have not performed very well. So that's I would say, definitely one thing that has happened. Then there's also a specific reason why these two large parties have lost a lot of votes. If we look at the socialist parties, where they tended to get their votes, the working class, well, it just happens that if you look at the working class and the importance of industry in Western European economies, that industry has become less important as a share of the economy, and as a result of that, their potential pool of voters for these socialist parties has shrunk. If you look at the Christian Democratic parties, a lot of people tended to vote for them automatically for religious reasons, but since religion has become almost insignificant in European politics, one of the main reasons for people to vote for these parties also disappeared. So the potential pool of voters for these two parties, or the loyal voters who would always vote for these two parties, has gone down dramatically. Now, what has been the response of these parties to that? They, so far, have not really been able to give a very good response. And I think the main issue that they have failed to address so far in Europe, which is maybe not necessarily different from what has happened in the United States, is that the two or the main parties have not really given an answer to the question, what should we do to make sure that the welfare state that we built in the post-war period will be able to survive in an environment with increased global economic competition. Most political parties throughout Europe have not really told voters, okay, we cannot preserve this system. We'll have to introduce some dramatic reforms if we want to preserve the essential aspects of this system, if we want to prevent abuse of the system, and so on. So most of these political parties have continued to make people believe that they can basically just continue and go on as they have in the past few decades. But since they have failed to deliver on these promises, voters have turned to other parties. They have turned to fringe parties that didn't used to be all that important, protest parties like in Italy, or in countries where there have been large regional differences, also large perceived regional differences in the abuse of the welfare state. People have turned to nationalist parties. Now, what have the main parties done in reaction to this? Well, on the right especially, the traditional parties have reacted by becoming a bit more nationalist themselves. On the left, it seems to me that the main parties on the left so far have not really found a way to deal with this problem, except maybe in the most northern countries, in Scandinavian countries, where they have tried to preserve the welfare state by making some concessions on issues that they didn't seem to consider as very essential to the preservation of the welfare state. They've made labor markets more flexible. They've invested more in subsidies to companies to encourage innovation and things like that. But more in the south, I believe that socialist parties so far have not really come up with a very good answer to the question, how can we make our welfare states survive? And I think that is the fundamental problem that underlies the decline in support for the traditional political parties in Europe. I think that's what I wanted to say as my initial remarks.
Thank you very much. The second speaker is Hahrie, who for political science is unusual because she actually has worked in campaigns. She worked in Senator Bradley's campaign, which did not become President Bradley.
It wasn't my fault.
She changed, it wasn't her fault, she always said. She changed that in 2008 and 2012 by working in President Obama's campaigns. And her topic today is changing campaign strategies.
Thank you. I want to start just by thanking the Asan Institute for inviting me here today to be part of this conference, and it's a real honor to be on the panel with everyone else here. I think that we're talking about partisan disorder around the world, and each of us is taking a different area of the world, and I'm here to talk about the United States. And so I thought that I would start by talking about sort of two trends that are changing in U.S. politics right now. And so the first is that there's a big demographic shift that's happening in the United States. According to U.S. Census projections, by 2045, there's going to be no majority racial ethnic group in the United States, that whites will be less than 50% of the population. Hispanics are projected to be 18% of the population in 2015, and they think that it's almost going to double by 2060, so they'll be 31% of the population. And Asians, just for reference, they're 5% of the population in 2015. They're projected to be 8% of the population by 2060. And so we have these really fast-growing minority groups in the United States that's changing the party base. And the second shift I want to talk about is technology. We all know that technology has been changing politics all over the world. Just looking at the Arab Spring and things like that, you can see the ways in which technology is changing the ways in which people participate in the political system. Another indicator of that is if you look at the 2008 election in the United States, which is often thought of as the social media election, because Barack Obama for the first time used social media in his campaign to great effect, there were 1.8 million tweets on election day in 2008. Now in 2013, there's about 1.8 million tweets every 6 minutes. Right? And so just in those 4 years, the number of people that are tweeting around the world has really changed dramatically. And so the question I want to take up today is, so how are parties in the United States reacting to this? And I thought I'd start by looking at the US election in 2012 as a way of beginning to get some traction on that question. And so I think one trend that we see in U.S. elections over the past decade or so is there's an increased focus on mobilization. There's an increased focus on the ground game in campaigns. And so if you look at data from the American National Election Study, which is a study that's been run every election year since about the 1950s, from about the 1950s till 2000, about 25% of the population report having been contacted by a party in an election year. But beginning in 2004, you had about 35% of the people reporting being contacted, and by 2008, the number's over 40%, right? So just in a few election cycles, we've gone from 25% to over 40% of people reporting being contacted by an election party. And so those numbers might not be perfect because people always report that it's based on people's self-report data, but I think the trend is clear that there's a lot more focus on the ground game than what we've seen before. And I think a lot of people, when they look at campaigns, pundits and political scientists alike have tended to focus a lot on the money game, looking at how much money campaigns have as a way of trying to understand what kind of resources they have to bring to bear to the campaign. But I think with the growth of ground operations, part of what we want to begin to look at is the way in which they deploy their resources on the ground. And the reason for that is in a close race, the ground game can really be decisive, right? And so the way battleground states are playing out in U.S. elections these days, you have a lot of states that are being decided by very close margins, and there the ground game can be the margin of victory. So in 2012, for example, Obama for America had a much superior ground game to the Romney campaign, and so they collected, for example, 1.8 million voter registration forms, meaning they registered almost 2 million new voters, and in 5 states, the number of voter registration forms that they collected was the margin of victory in battleground states. They also won the early votes in key states like Florida, Ohio, Nevada. None of these things are decisive by any stretch of the imagination. There's so much else going on in a campaign, but I think these things they make a difference in a way that we haven't paid attention to as much. And so if you look at what they did, they had 313 more field offices than Romney did. On Facebook, Obama had over 20 million more likes than the Romney campaign did. He had over 18 million more followers on Twitter. His campaign had over 18 million more followers on Twitter than Romney. So they were just deploying their field operation a lot more effectively. And so one of the things I wanted to think about today then is, well, so how did they do it? What did they do that the Romney campaign didn't do? And so one way to assess a campaign's field operation is to look at voter contact. Voter contact is sort of the gold standard in what the ground operation is trying to do. What they're trying to do is basically call or meet or talk to as many voters as they can to try to persuade them and or get them to turn out to vote for their candidate on election day. And usually if you look at traditional campaigns, if you sort of see like how voter contact increases over time, it's a pretty straight line, right? They start off pretty slow in the beginning of the summer, let's say. They build up slowly, and then before election day, the number of voter contacts they're making goes up dramatically. In the Obama campaign, if you look at their rate of voter contact, the line was almost flat throughout the entire summer. They made very little voter contact throughout the summer, and then after the convention in early September, but then really in October, the month before the election, the line just skyrockets. So it looks like a hockey stick lying down, right? It's straight all the way, and then it skyrockets up the past. And so what they were doing is they were thinking about a new way of running field campaigns in U.S. politics. So traditionally, what field campaigns do is campaigns will hire a bunch of young people to go out to battleground states and then spend months and many, many hours and many sleepless nights just contacting and talking to as many voters as they can, trying to get them to turn out to vote. What the Obama campaign did is during that time of the campaign when their levels of voter contact were almost flat, they were focused on, instead of hiring a bunch of young people to go out and run their field campaign, on investing in a lot of volunteers, right? So they were recruiting and training and equipping a lot of people who lived in their local neighborhoods in order to have those people be the ones who made the voter contact. Because there's all sorts of research that shows the more personalized the contact is, the more effective it is. And so by training all these neighborhood teams, then in the last month of the campaign, they were able to deploy all that power and make the same or more voter contacts in that last month than most campaigns make in the entire stretch of the field operation. And so I think that given the way demographics are changing in America and the fact that a lot of the minority voters that are beginning to become increasingly more of a majority in both parties, these voters are going to have to be mobilized in new ways, right? Because they're not necessarily the ones who are going to respond to the same kind of contacts that we've had in the past. And so the point that I want to make is I think one of the ways in which parties are reacting to some of the demographic and technological changes that we're seeing is through sort of an increased focus on this mobilization pattern and a shift in the way that they're doing it. I think Obama for America in 2012 was a good example of that, but we're beginning to see that in a lot more campaigns, both Democratic and Republican, on both sides, that are already preparing for the 2014 election cycle, and I think will only ramp up even more in 2016. So I will stop there.
Okay, great. Thank you. The next speaker is Kim Jiyoon, who is, as I introduced her, does public opinion at Asan, and she's going to talk on Korean politics.
Thank you. And first of all, I'd like to thank Professor Brady to be here in the panel with me. And this is 2 times in a row, only the last year. And also Professor Mofiarina, if you ever have taken the course in American Politics 101, then you guys are going to encounter those 2 names very, very frequently. So the title of this session is Stability and the Change of the Post-Crisis Party System. As yesterday's keynote speaker, Professor Stephen Kressner, aptly put, I think as domestic politics cannot be the part away from the global crisis that we observe right now. But when I was asked to talk something about the post-crisis and the party system in Korea, there's 2 questions in my mind that I have to figure out. So first is what crisis are you talking about? And secondly, has party system of Korea ever stable so that I can say something about the change in the party system? Regarding the first question, people from Europe and the United States maybe think about when it comes to crisis, you can think about the economic crisis in 2008. But in Korea, it is not the only one. We always have been in the regional security crisis since probably 2007, and also we together experienced the economic crisis, of course, since 2008. And most recently, we have a nuclear crisis initiated from the north. So basically, the Korea continuously has been in the crisis mode almost every day. So please pick any one crisis for me so I can take the question and the answer to that. And the second question is that, so it raised a fundamental doubt that do we ever have a party system that we can call it stable? So I can talk about some changes after whatever crisis that is. So the problem is the Korean party system has never been really stable. Since the democratization in the year of 1987, the parts of Korea has experienced frequent mergers and split and the change of the names. And when I counted and calculated, the average life cycle of the Korean parties after democratization was 5 years. So we continue to change the names or split and merge in the parties. And if you ever witnessed the last year's presidential election, and then you probably also heard of the Anchor-Su phenomenon, that might be really weird to many eyes from the European countries and the US, because this guy is independent, has never ever been in the politics, and all of a sudden came out of nowhere, and then, well, I'm running for the president. And then he actually was quite a strong candidate, and he maintained at least 30% of the support throughout the year, and even before he dropped out of the race in late in November. So, well, so you have to understand that how the Korean parties are distrusted by the electorates and invulnerable to any outside attack in the elections. But it's also hard to declare that then the Korean party system very weak, unstable, and vulnerable, and well, it is always in disarray because even though they have changed their names, but two party lines, major party lines and the lineage since the democratization in 1987. So the Saenuri Party, current one, which is actually the collection of the people who were co-opters of the authoritarian regime, and the DUP has the origin and the root for the dissident of the democratization movement. And currently, I would say that 30 and 35% of electorates, they can identify with the Saenuri Party, and 20 to 25% of electorates, they identify with the DUP. And around 10 or 15% the rest, other parties, and the rest will be the independents who say, oh, I don't really support any of the parties. And it has been quite a solid, the support rate was quite solid throughout the 2 or 3 years since we started our own poll in the Asan Institute. So once the two parties, so we started the democratization, was divided into two lines that I just briefly mentioned. So first is authoritarian co-opters, second democratization dissidents. And well, soon it was replaced by the national security issue, particularly how to deal with the North Korea. And I would say probably the year around 2000, when there was a summit between the North Korea and the South Korea, and probably most well known by the Sunshine Policy. So if you're pro-Sunshine Policy, then you probably identify with DUP line. And if you're against the Sunshine Policy, or any economic, unconditional economic aid to North Korea, then you probably identified with the Saenuri Party. And it has been quite strong, actually, and until very recently, that was the main factor to divide the partisans, the electorates to the party affiliation, and the parties had a very different stake and position on that issues. Well, we all witnessed the turbulence in North and South relations most recently, and there's a nuclear test, and well, the Kaesong complex, so just very recently, they shut down the Kaesong complex, and they withdraw all of the workers from there. And it had some change, and it remained in that way, some changes at still the party levels. The Saenuri Party, the supporters of them, and also party, it was a great chance for them to solidify their voting bloc and the base. So they also urged the independents and the moderates, well, those in the humanitarian aid to North Korea and Sunshine Policy was totally futile. And it seems that, according to our poll, many of Korean electors agree with that idea. Well, for the DUP party, this is the party that's in trouble, huge trouble, because so far the rationale against the Lee Myung-bak government, the hardline policy, and defend the Sunshine Policy was that, well, during the Sunshine Policy and progressive president, we were actually, at least living in a peaceful era and coexisted, even though it was not really a great relationship. But now it seems that almost everyone, not everyone, 70 or 80% of Koreans agree that, well, no more economic aid without the North Korea's apology. So it seems that they are really having a hard time to persuade the voters to take side with them. And more seriously, the young generation, like those who are in their 20s, they more and more agree with the Saenuri Party's rather assertive and reciprocal approach to the North Korea. And that would be particularly very difficult for the DUP and opposition parties to recruit new voters in the future. But there's a change part, the global economic crisis. Well, to parties, I personally think the parts of Korea has not been very much dramatically different in the economic policies until very recently. I mean, it was late President Kim Dae-jung who accepted all the requests from IMF and also and urged Korean industry to do the restructuring. And another progressive president, Roh Moo-hyun, he was the one who initiated Korea's FTA. I mean, what kind of progressive president can initiate the FTA, free trade agreement? But it was under Lee Myung-bak government that Korean people started to see the inequality and what's the difference at party level, the fiscal policy. I think President Lee Myung-bak, he actually performed pretty well. I think he overperformed to overcome the economic crisis after the 2008 global economic crisis. Because all the indices, national indices, indicates that, I mean, even though I not particularly like him, but I have to accept that he did a pretty good job on that. But it it raised new demand from the voters that, okay, we have done enough about the economic development and the growth. Then what about redistribution this time? Maybe we can take more focus on the redistribution of wealth and social welfare. So you probably remember that those turbulent years like 2010 and 2011 and 12. Social welfare, a free lunch program, and economic democratization. That is a slogan that appeared in the last year's presidential election. And according to the Asan annual poll, we have been asking the same question repeatedly since 2010. So which aspect do you think that we have to focus more on in economic policy? So first, economic growth or redistribution of wealth. And year 2012 is the first year that we observed that more than the majority of Koreans think that we have to focus more and put more effort on the redistribution of the wealth. So even more surprising thing is that we gradually start to see that there's a partisan divide among the people, the electorates. It is not the party platform, but the people actually perceive that it's a different platform, and I take side with my party, and I take side with the economic growth or the redistribution of the wealth. Of course, there are some blurry points, like I remember 2012 at the presidential election. Now the President Park Geun-hye, she mentioned the social welfare 2011, and also she mentioned the economic democratization. I perceived that she meant that the regulations on the big businesses, but whatever that means, I'm still not really clear. But it seems that Hahrie Party, they admit that there's a huge inequality in the society, so maybe we have to remedy it, but in a rather gradual and slow pace. But the DUP and UPP, they are asking for the reform in a more radical way. And then it appears that the voters perceive that what they mean and what they relatively well. So in conclusion, the Korean party system is still the face of burgeoning and developing the agenda. It has long been the personalized mechanism for the party bosses for their own presidential ambition, I have to say. But now they just start to develop the agenda. It has been the national security and still remains there. But now we start to develop economic differences in economic policies, redistribution or social welfare. I'm not really sure, but maybe in 10 years, maybe we can observe another issue dimension comes out, such as social issues like abortion and gay marriage we see in the United States. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. Our last speaker is Professor Kohno.
Well, thank you. Let me thank first ASEAN Institute for inviting me to this conference, and I also like to thank David Brady for organizing this panel. And I particularly thank the organizers to include Japan in this panel, because Japan seems to be ignored these days, and nobody seems to care about Japan anymore. I would like to be very simple in my presentation. The panel's theme is crisis and stability of party system, but I think listening to what have been said, discussed yesterday, throughout the discussions, the hidden agenda seems to be how this partisan stability or instability is going to have an implications for stability in international systems. So my talking points, which I prepared a month ago, is only about the former part, but I might, if I have time, then I'm going to talk a little bit about the second, this implication for the international stability as well. Let me start with the observations about two critical elections that have happened recently in Japan. One was the 2009 election in which Democratic Party of Japan, DPJ, won landslide. And we thought that this was going to be the arrival of a true two-party system, stable two-party system, finally in Japan. And then DPJ was devastatingly lost the elections in 2012. LDP and LDP-led coalition came back to power into last December. And as you probably know, Abe has got overwhelming majority in the lower house. Now he's preparing for the upper house elections in July. Now, so there seemed to be a volatility, increased volatility between those two elections. What happened in between those two elections are the March 11th, 2011 earthquake. And this was unquestionably the big crisis for Japan's political economy in many senses. 20,000 people have died or even still missing. Nuclear accident happened in Fukushima, and the Tohoku economy was devastated, and we had to put a lot of resources for the recovery and reconstruction. So this was an external shock to Japan's political system. Did earthquake have anything to do with the demise of the DPJ or the evolution party politics ever since? The answer is yes, but only indirectly, in my opinion. What we have witnessed after 3/11 earthquake are three big trends. One is the internal dissolution of DPJ, Democratic Party of Japan. There is, you have to say, post-crisis anti-incumbency sentiment. Everything what government does is not enough for this kind of crisis management. So the DPJ, which happened to be in power after the earthquake, had to be subject to a lot of criticism by the people, not doing enough, not doing fast enough, and so on. So there was an anti-incumbency sentiment in the first place. And also, the DPJ, because they won the landslide in the 2009 election, they had such a electorally vulnerable first-timers in the party. And they felt really vulnerable to this kind of anti-incumbency pressure. So they had to be very critical of the top executive of the DPJ, and they started to have a sort of separate movement within the party. So that led to a dissolution of DPJs in many senses. The second big trend is the rise of local parties. And at first, local parties were not coordinated. First, the Ishihara, who now retired from the Tokyo Metropolitan Governor to become a National Diet member, had his own movement in Tokyo. And Hashimoto, who is now the leader of the Restoration Party, was a leader in an Osaka regional party. And these regional parties weren't coordinated. But these two parties got together afterwards, and it became an established Restoration Party, which is a big event. The third important trend is an increased distrust among the voters. They were fed up with the LDP before. They're now fed up with the DPJ. They don't know what to do with the anti-government sentiment. So there is a widespread distrust towards the political system in general. So these three trends have contributed to the 2012 election in which LDP-led coalition won a landslide. But LDP won, but the voter turnout went 10% down from the previous election, which means that there's a widespread sort of anti-political sentiment. The other important reason why LDP was able to win so many seats is because of the lack of coordination among the non-LDP camp. As I said, there's a new party called the Restoration Party, which is competing in many districts with LDP and also DPJ candidates, and DPJ and the Restoration Party had to split the vote. So LDP kind of gained a lot of seats from those benefited from the lack of coordination between those two opposition camps. My predictions toward next election, probably LDP will win. And more longer-term prediction will be that I think that there will be a pressure toward the party system in Japan to come back to some kind of two-party system. And I don't want to go into details of what Japan's party electoral system is like, because I think just to explain that, it takes 5 minutes. So I'm not going to go into details, but there is it's a partly single-member district competition system under which the two candidate competitions is more likely to be dominating, and there's a sort of inherent pressure toward convergence for the two party system, at least two candidate systems in each electoral district. Now the question is whether this will become a two-party system at the national level is questionable. It seems that the Restoration Party is going to stay, and so unless there is some kind of movement between the Restoration Party and DPJ to get their act together, I think the LDP's dominance might prevail. But I think there will be some kind of coordination in the long run, so there will be another two-party system sometime later on. But this the fundamental volatility of the Japanese party system is not related only to the electoral system of the lower house, which I've been talking about. I think that the fundamental problem of the Japanese party system, or the instability of the Japanese party system, lies in the fact that there is a so low party identification among the Japanese voters. I always said this in my first year political science class. In the United States, there's a conversation, you can have a conversation, say, are you Republican, are you Democrat? And, Republicanness or Democraticness is a part of the identity, partisan identity. You can't have that kind of conversation in Japan. And I think that part of the reason why this kind of party identification lacks in Japan is because of the uncoordinated institutions, uncoordinated electoral system. House of Representatives have one system, House of Councilors have one system, governorship and mayorship has a presidential system, and the local assemblies have totally another system. So every time you go to the vote, you see a different slate of candidates, slate of parties, a different kind of coalition makings going on. So that's a fundamental problem. Now let me touch a little bit on the question of nationalism. Now that Abe has won a landslide, and there are a lot of worries in yesterday's panels about how right-wing or how conservative Abe's policy is going to look like. I think that the rhetoric of Abe does not reflect the nationalism on the part of the electorate. I have done monthly surveys for the last 17 or 18 months using the web. And I have 3 points in date, 3 points, 2012 January, 2012 August, and 2013 February. And I can compare some of the support level for the policies for national security and the defense among the voters. And there have been systemic increase in the support for policies, for example, for U.S.-Japan, strengthening of U.S.-Japan alliance, strengthening of self-defense forces, strengthening of cybersecurity measures, and so forth. So, one of those months, August 2012, was the month in which Japan faced another external crisis of President Lee Myung-bak landing on the Dokdo Island, and also Chinese Hong Kong activists landed in the Senkaku Island also. So there have been a sort of heightened sense of national security among the Japanese voters, and these 3 points trends. If you look at the trends among those 3 points, you can see the general increase of the national security consciousness among the Japanese voters. But if you ask the questions about the possession of nuclear weapons, introduction of the citizens conscription, or the constitutional revisions to make the self-defense forces into regular military, the support level is very low, and it went up in the month of August, in which these crises happened, but when we're back to the normal level. So at the elite level, there seems to be a movement toward the right and conservative, but that is hardly reflecting the overall sentiment, overall preference of the Japanese voters. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Before we turn to the questions, and I'm told that you can actually get these on Twitter. I don't know that I'm capable of doing that, but we'll take questions. But this panel has sort of a reasonably long history. Various parts of it began in Taiwan when we tried to look at a question of polarization and what caused polarization of the political parties. And that, one of the things that came out of that was, well, the economic crisis, the fact of globalization without the crisis, but add the crisis to globalization, was causing something of this party split. And essentially, many countries were facing the problem that Christophe mentioned. You have unfunded liabilities. Is it possible to, it's not possible to keep all the promises that have been made to all the citizens. So we then had a long conference in Rome on this question. And the idea, of course, is that what should be happening is, as they're not fixing the problem, as it becomes clearer and clearer that the welfare state as we know it can't be sustained, the question is something ought to be happening in political parties. Unfortunately, at that conference and the one at Stanford, it became clear that political parties are, as Masaru said, they differ dramatically across countries. So in the United States, and the trouble with thinking about party identification is that because party identification was first started in the United States in the 50s, everybody else followed that model. But it turns out that in multi-party systems, people don't have that same party identification. I happen to believe that in the United States, people don't have that same party identification. The most impressive thing over the last 30 years in the United States is the rise of independents. Now, in our profession, there's some dispute about whether those independents are closet partisans or not. But the question of the rise of independence may mean that that's one of the things that's happening with voters. So I think that across this thing, there's two fundamental questions that have yet to be answered, and it's an ongoing project. The first is voters in most countries are centrists, it seems to me, in the sense that what they want is they want the government to solve the problem. And the second thing is governments are not solving the problem. And normally in democratic countries, the way that problem gets resolved is, say, the Christian Democrats who were always in the coalition in Italy during the period of the first and second great economic revivals, as in the United States during the New Deal, as in Japan in 1955 when the LDP solved. So we have not had, I don't think there's a single country represented up here or in any of the OECD or G20 countries that has resolved this problem about long-term futures. And I continue to believe that the study of political parties and elections is crucial to understanding how and when that will be resolved. So with that sort of general statement, we'll take questions from the audience. And my thing here says that it's trying to connect with Twitter, but it's not. So we'll take questions from the audience. Or I could read the question from the Twitter, which is nothing. Yes, sir. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Wait for the microphone. Are you supposed to identify yourself too? Well, you may as well.
Might as well. Hi, my name's Youngmin. I'm a former intern at the Asan Institute. I guess my first instinct coming in and listening to this panel is what are the similarities and the differences? And because we have experts from all the different countries, I think this panel offers that special opportunity to take that comparative perspective. And I feel like a resonating theme that I've seen is something that you spoke of, I guess, polarization, but also this sense of disaffection with the main parties, main political parties. Obviously, in Europe, as you mentioned, you have the shift away from the Christian Social Democrats. In the U.S., you saw the rise of the Tea Party in Obama's first term, and we touched upon how in Korea we had the An phenomenon and so on and so forth. But I think it'd be interesting to ask or probe the reasons as to why that is in each country. And although we see the similar theme, it may be so that the reasons are different. For example, is it economic or is it more so an ideological phenomenon? I don't think we would characterize the rise of the Tea Party or equate the causes of that with, say, the An phenomena, which was more about economy, redistribution. So I guess that would be my question. What the reasons are in the respective countries that cause this kind of unified.
Okay, so there's two ways we can do this. You can volunteer, or I'll call on somebody.
I can say something.
All right, okay, you start.
Save the rest of you. Well, so speaking about the United States, I mean, I think this gets back to a point that Professor Brady made earlier, which is that, I think it's right that voters fundamentally want government to solve problems, and part of what's going on is that government's not solving, like our governmental institutions aren't equipped to solve a lot of the problems that we are facing right now in our politics, and I think that's true across the world in a lot of instances. And so what we're seeing is that, we're in a situation where, if we look over the past several decades, then the economy is transitioning into an information economy. So there's economic uncertainty that's going on. There are big demographic shifts that are going on. There's economic crisis, and there's a lot of international instability. As sort of the world powers begin to shift, and all of that creates a lot of uncertainty. And at least in the U.S., our political parties, I think neither of them have really been able to mobilize institutional power in such a way that they can address some of the problems and the uncertainty that's arising out of all these different factors. And so that's where you have a lot of the disaffection that you're talking about coming out of. So the Tea Party from the conservative side and Occupy Wall Street on the liberal side, and a lot of these other things are just symptoms of the fact that government seems gridlocked all the time. It doesn't seem able to address the issues that need to be addressed.
Masaru?
Well, if I may comment on Korean case, well, if you look at the turnout, you can totally see that how vaccinated the voters are from the political parties. The turnout in 1987, 1988 was over like 80%. But now, well, last year's presidential election was a kind of particular one, but before that, the presidential election in 2007, it was 63% of turnout, which is, I think, a record lowest. And then the political efficacy, when you do the survey, the people, so how do you think the politicians do hear your voice, and do you think your vote matters, and do you think you can change the politics? And we observe really, really low percentage of people think so. But all the things, I would say that this is transitional era of Korean political system, and that we have been dominated by those political bosses, and also basically the parties were working as a driving force to put them in the blue house. And then now we are kind of forming the real political party system. I mean, I'm not saying that we are going to be resembling the European party system or US party system, but we are going into some new phase. And the blame can be laid on the lack of opposition parties' ability to provide an alternative to the voters, particularly the young generation. So they cannot really agree with the agendas and platforms of secondary parties in many respects, but they cannot really find any alternative from the opposition parties because they are totally in disarray, having lost the Kim Dae-jung and the Roh Moo-hyun, and then without the strong leader and the structure of the party, they cannot really give any options for the young voters particularly. And then they feel alienated from the party system, and then that connected with the lowering the party identification, the percentage, and also do not really see any solution. And then that's probably why they're so enthusiastic of the Ahn Cheol-soo. And they believe to see that, oh, maybe this is a guy who can bring us the reformed political party system. So, well, it's not particularly the disaffection, but I would say that, well, this is transitional phase. So, well, maybe in 5 years and 10 years, when the opposition party side, they are recuperated and recovered, then probably we can change the party system and see the different one.
Professor Kohno?
I may differ a little bit from the two comment two of my colleagues who spoke earlier, which is to say that we tend to be very myopic about these kind of things, and I think that that movements like Tea Party, I wouldn't say exactly the same kind of movement, but I think there has been always movements like that within each country, and I think the parties and party system in general seems to sort of adapt and sort of carry on with this kind of political apathy or in the sense of alienation. So. I don't particularly think that the recent phenomena is particularly noteworthy in the sense that, there's radical movements breaking away from the traditional party system or anything like that, at least in advanced industrial democracies.
Okay. Christophe, you only have 27 countries to cover, so.
Okay. And I will
Just pick
throw
a
in the
couple.
US also.
Okay, make it 28.
I would just say that I don't know much about Korea or Japan, but if I look at European and American politics, my impression sometimes is that the crisis of the welfare state, as we know it in Europe and to some extent in the US, is maybe not big enough, and that as long as people can continue to believe that they can carry on paying relatively low taxes in one country at least, or having very generous benefits in the 27 others, given the tax rates in the latter case and the spending in the first case, as long as people sort of continue to believe that it's possible to maintain that system, and there are some parties, whether they're established parties or new movements like the Tea Party that offer easy solutions to the problems, they will continue to believe that easy solutions are possible. And in a way, I think the crisis needs to become bigger for politicians to be willing to really tackle the problems. And as long as they don't really do that, dissatisfaction or disaffection with the voters will continue, I would think.
I want to just add one little thing to that. Professor Piran and I did a piece on the 2010 election, which was a big switch to the Republicans in the U.S. Congress. And at the end of that, we had a table saying when you asked Americans what they should cut and what they should continue to spend more on, our friend Roberto Dallamonte at the University of Italy looked at the table. Well, he said, you're just like us Italians. You don't want any taxes, and you want to spend more on everything that benefits us. And I think what Christophe and the others have said, I think that's sort of essentially correct. The public opinion polls show people don't want to be cut on stuff that affects them. They want more spending on that. And in the United States, my favorite is they always want to cut foreign aid. And you point out to them that it's less than 1/4% of the budget, and it won't help any. You go back and ask the same people 3 months later, and they still want to cut foreign aid. So other questions? Yes, over here. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is To Kin Woon from Malaysia. I have a question for our friend from Japan. I'm not sure whether it's accurate to say that or describe Japan as a one-party state. I mean, except for, I think, a couple of years in the 80s when the Japan Socialist Party came to power, and the last 5 years before the recent elections, when the Democratic Party came to power. I mean, the LDP ruled Japan almost in an uninterrupted fashion for close to half a century. Now, what is the cause for this? Is it due to money politics? I ask because it would seem to me that you need a lot of money to be elected to the Diet. And there have been stories of Japanese politicians taking money to finance party activities and so forth. And that leaves, therefore, little space for parties that represent, say, the poorer strata of Japanese society to have any impact or any real chance at capturing power. And added to that, of course, is the role of the bureaucracy. How true it is that ideologically the bureaucracy, although supposedly to be a neutral institution, supports the LDP to a large extent, at least, quietly. Thank you.
Masaru, I don't think there's anyone else on the panel that can bail you out on this one.
Okay, cause of one-party dominance in Japanese politics. If you find that answer, you can write a PhD thesis at any university, top university. And I'm sure there are lots of complex combinations of forces that are going into the creating one. But I guess I have a different view about when you say one-party state, that it seems to imply there is a lack of competition between parties or between candidates, and that is not the case. The parties have been always competing with each other even under the one-party rule from 1955 to 1993, and then there was a government change in 1993, even though it lasted for a year. LDP came back to power, but only so with the coalition partner. The upper house has been dominated by the opposition camp, and a two-party system have emerged in the last 10 years or so, and the DPJ the Democratic Party of Japan, have emerged as an alternative party. It just happened to be that this party wasn't successful in the last election. So it's not like a totalitarian state where the one party dominates in terms of ideologies and the method of communications and so forth. There has been always competition, and that's my view. And the patterns of competition, I think, have been shaped by, in many ways, many respects, by the existing institutional arrangements, including the electoral system. That is my view.
Well, just a little follow-up on that. Just as in the American South, the Democratic Party was dominant, in India, the Congress Party was dominant for a long time period, in part because they let anybody in. And so the changing factions, like when Tanaka comes in Japan, that surely has to be, well, the LDP of 1960 isn't the LDP of 1980 because of factions. That's also correct?
Yes, that's correct. But you can only have that kind of explanation in retrospect. So
yes, that's well, I'm very good at post-diction.
Okay.
Okay, other questions? Yeah, over here, sorry.
Hi. Hello. Okay, can you hear me?
No.
So let me ask. So there seems to be a debate about, on the one hand, changes in the nature or the character of the party system. On the other hand, there's another issue about systemic changes in the party system as a whole. And there was some discussion about whether or not, and I think the debate is, the way I understand it, whether crises actually do have a significant impact systemically on the party system itself. What I wanted to ask was, is that ever even possible? And you have systemic changes in the party system through some sort of big shifts that might occur in a voting population. For instance, one issue that is quite controversial, or everybody's talking about in the U.S., is the demographic shift that's slowly happening, and is a train wreck that's likely to happen in the near future for the Republican Party. So, and if you look, and you mentioned a bit on globalization towards the end of the panel discussion, we have in Korea, for instance, a National Assembly member that was born in Korea for the first time. So I wanted to ask whether demographic shifts could have potentially a huge impact on the party system itself. That is, could it have not just on the character and the nature of the party system, but real systemic change?
Yeah. Anybody? Hahrie? Anybody?
Sure. Well, so I'm not totally sure what you mean by systemic shifts versus just change in ideology or character of the party, but I think definitely, like, history shows us that parties are strategic, right? And so what parties are trying to do is they want to mobilize as big a base of the population as they can in order to win elections and maintain control. And so, for example, around the New Deal, where we saw, big economic crisis, and this is in the United States, big economic crisis, and then the parties kind of having to make this decision about whether or not they wanted to sort of accept the broad outlines of the New Deal, then you saw the Republicans try to resist it for several elections, and then they eventually gave in once it became clear that the population wasn't there. And so then, the parties the Democratic and Republican Party sort of changed a little bit what the meaning of that party was. And so I think it's possible that could happen with the demographic changes that are going on right now. As some have mentioned, certainly the Republicans are facing this crisis right now of being able to reach out to minority voters in the United States. And so one big question is how they're going to shift their policy, if at all, around issues like immigration or other issues that might be relevant to some of those populations. And so I think it's unclear right now how long that's going to take, but how long it's going to take for the Republican Party to shift, but I think it's very clear that eventually, within the next generation, as this generation of voters ages and becomes a bigger part of the voting population, that they're going to have to change. And so whether or not that's a systemic shift or not, I think it depends exactly on how you define systemic.
I think the question as to whether the party system can withstand the the pressures or the demographic shifts that is occurring in, I think that varies across different countries. For example, in Japan's case, there's no problem with except for in a minor case, the ethnicity problems. The demographic shift in Japan is an age problem. And that seemed to be a totally different problem than the one that she was describing about the US cases. I don't know about South Korea, but maybe at some point Japan would open up for more immigrants, and that might create a ethnic demographic shift. That would have a huge impact, but I don't think that's going to happen in the near future.
I guess I have sort of an answer. So we have, in a project with colleagues at Stanford, we've collected about 1,000 Gallup polls back to 1937, and then looked at change over time across the regions, and there has been, over that time frame, quite a change in regional party strength. So the South and the Southwest are Republican, the Northeast and New England have become very Democratic, so on. And in addition to that, there seems to be a rise in this uncertainty about Democrats have about a 4-point lead, and then independents it's about a third, just roughly speaking. And if you mean, so over time, does that change? Well, if you mean by systemic change, voters change their minds. Surely a part of that is true, right? Because American voters prior to the 1930s would have thought no government aid. So the question prior to the New Deal was government aid or no government aid. And then after the New Deal, the parties sorted on the basis of how much government aid. And again, it does seem to me that in the U.S. and France and Europe, in the 1890s, which is also a period of very intense globalization, the same sets of issues come up. Bankruptcy, immigration, currency floats, exchanges, how much trade, protectionism. That same set of issues come up, and countries reacted differently. In the United States, it decided to go with a global system. In France, they decided not to, and therefore their industry was hurt for a long time. It seems to me that same set of issues is present before us, complicated now by the fact that it's much bigger, in that it now includes Asia and most of the world's population, India, that it didn't before. So I'm not surprised that governments have not been able to make this change, and that citizens have not made a switch as they did prior to the New Deal. But I think without such systemic changes, at least in terms of public opinion, then I think that we're in for a rather long period of instability till we get these problems solved.
Well, if I may,
Yeah.
about the Korean
Kim,
case.
Dr. Kim?
So about the demographic shift, well, the Korean case is a very similar case to the Japanese one. We don't really have much of appearance of problems with ethnicity and also immigrants, while the percentage of immigrants and the multicultural family of Korean population is less than 2%. So it is kind of too premature to worry about it and how it will affect the party system. But as in Japan, we see the huge age gaps. And well, I was doing the survey and studying the presidential election 2012, and actually I was working on the gender gap, if there is any, in the Korean voters. Overall, I didn't find any, but it was a huge gender gap among those who are in their 20s. And the 20s, young female voters are very much more progressive. And they really, really hate it for whatever reason, the President Park Geun-hye. And the males and the male voters in their 20s, they were very much conservative. I guess probably that's why national security issue, because they're the people who actually have to serve the military service in a mandatory way. And they feel the physical threat by the North Korea as a provocation. So well, this is overall, if you look at in the surface, you see the huge age gaps from the 820s and the 60s. But if you look at it within the age cohort, you see also the gaps between the female and the male voters. So the multicultural society, well, it's a long way to go, but we probably encounter huge age gaps and problems, and maybe the gender gap in the foreseeable future.
Okay. Other questions? What questions? I don't
if
have
I
a
may
Twitter.
comment a little bit about the nationalism that discussed by Professor Kohno, we did a similar survey last year, just right before the election, Japan's election. And then we were actually expecting that the huge criticism on the visit doctored by President Lee Myung-bak and the sex slave issues, it was just probably the political rhetoric, and maybe Japanese electors do not really care much about it and then have different idea on that. What we found was we didn't release it because we didn't want to spoil your election, but the fact is almost 90% of Japanese people actually thought it was inappropriate for President Myung-bak to visit Tokyo. And also they thought it was enough of apology has been done by the Japan on the sex slave issues and on the Imperial Japan in the 1940s. So it was slightly disagree with your result, I would say. I don't know, maybe it has changed in 1 year. But one thing that we found was that still more than 60% of Japanese voters, they thought, well, even though they agreed that, well, it was inappropriate and Tokyo or Takeshima is their own property, and, well, we've done enough about this apology, but please do not do anything to provoke the South Korea or China, and they didn't want it to see. So that from any government is coming in that time. So that was what the finding that we found.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I may have spoken a little to overgeneralize some of my results, but as you said, actually, in the months right after the President Lee Myung-bak's visit to Dr. Takeshima Island, I also did a survey, even through the sorry, but this is just for the web. But so it doesn't have representativeness of the entire populations. But I was very amazed how hawkish the younger generations of the Japanese were. In fact, it was really clear that the younger generation, some 30 to 40% of the younger generations were even advocating using the military forces to take back the Takeshima Island. But I think that, and also, unfortunately for the audience, the feeling thermometer towards South Korea and the feeling thermometer toward China have went down really low after those incidents. And I don't think they'll come back in the long run, in the short run. I think the feeling thermometers are usually stable, but this drop is very significant. I don't think they'll come. But in terms of the policy measures, I think that they are really sort of the electorates reflect a sort of sense of realism in the sense that some of the measures that if they want were presented as a choice of whether to adapt or not adapt, I think that they come to the conclusion, oh, this is not going to happen. This is too. So yes, there is a sense of sort of instant sort of very traumatic reaction to the incidents, but on the other hand, I think at the deep down in electors, there is a sort of calm and a sense of realism still prevailing in the Japanese. I hope that is the case.
Okay. I would be remiss in my duties, because that's a very good question on demographics and change, if I didn't ask Christophe to, in the last 3 minutes, summarize demographic change across all of Europe. But I presume by doing this, you're going to talk about the low birth rate and replacements.
Yeah, I would just like to make one comment in that context. I mean, everybody knows there's lots of a large immigrant population in a lot of European countries, and that the birth rate in general is quite low, and that as a result of that, a combination of these two effects, that the proportion of the immigrant population is increasing. Which is especially true in some of the larger urban areas. Now, I think one element that has gotten less attention in the media as well as in academics, I think, is that In several European countries, they've made it a lot easier to become naturalized citizens, to obtain citizenship, and sometimes also to obtain the right to vote without obtaining citizenship, as for example in the country where I grew up, in Belgium. And the result of that has been that, at least in larger cities in my own native land, in Brussels and Antwerp, that the left has become a lot stronger. And in my opinion, the parties on the left have deliberately extended citizenship rights and voting rights to immigrant populations to counterbalance the rise of nationalism and the rise of parties on the right. So I think that is definitely, given the demographic evolution, a factor that in the long run will work to the advantage of social democratic parties.
Okay, I guess we have time for one last question, or I could give a really long concluding remark. No, I'm kidding. Last question? Okay, if we have no question I would like to thank the Asan Institute for a second year in a row having me and letting us put together a panel of this nature. I especially like to thank the panelists for covering a wide variety of topics, doing so and succinctly. It's the first panel I've chaired in 20 years where I didn't have to pass something out saying, okay, your time is up. So I think we owe the panelists gratitude. Thank you.
So this